Hi everyone, can you hear me all right? Just type in yes. Great. I'm going to start in 1 minute. Still have a few more people joining. And can everyone see my screen all right? Just type in yes or hello. Perfect. Okay, good morning from New York and welcome to Bubble Webinar's Getting Started Using the API Connector. My name is Nirja and I'm a technical account manager at Bubble. I'm excited to walk you through the platform and show you how to use the API connector while building your app. So thank you for joining me today. Before we get started, let's discuss what's an API. An API is how services interact with each other programmatically. For example, when you log into another service using Facebook and share your profile picture, that is using an API. When you send text messages using Twilio, that is also an API. Today, we'll be diving into the fundamentals of integrating social media platforms like LinkedIn and Giphy into your Bubble app using the API connector. After this webinar, you will have the tools you need to allow your app users to sign up or log in with a social account, share data from their social account with your app, and control their social account using your app. With this foundation, you'll be able to build apps that are more user-friendly, shareable, and content-rich. This webinar will be recorded, and we will email you a link after the session so you can always rewatch at your convenience. For the method of this webinar, I'm going to be switching between a meeting roadmap so we can keep track of our progress and a test app. The roadmap will have some text for your future reference, including links to the API's developer documentation, but don't worry about catching it all, as most of our focus will be on the test app that we built together. The test app will have minimal formatting as we're using it to show concepts rather than design. We also have a Q&A open where you can ask questions. We will leave time at the end to cover top questions. So with that, let's begin. The topics we will cover today include understanding API documentation, initializing API calls with authentication, GET-POST calls with Giphy and LinkedIn. So as a first step, I'm going to create a new app in Bubble and install the API connector. And then this is my logged in view. And so once you're logged in, click New App. And I'm going to call this API 11, 15, 16. All right. And we don't need to start from a template, but you can if you have an existing template. And say, create new app. And this takes you to a brand new app. And let's say start with a blank page. And we can close this assistant. And so whereas in the previous session, we started out with an app that contained a database and we added information to the database, this time around, we're going to use an external source to pull in information into our app. And that's where APIs come into play. And so let's just start adding some content onto this page. And then we can talk more about how will we read API documentation so that we can extract information from an API. So we can start out with a input, and let's drop that in here. And then this input is where like your app users will type a search term, and we want that search term to pull relevant information. And so for this first example, we want to do something fun. We're going to pull in GIFs from Giphy. So we're going to look into Giphy's documentation on how we can extract fun GIFs by typing in a search term in here. So we will display the information, which will be the GIFs, in a repeating group that we can also draw right here. And let us make this a fixed number of cells. And then for rows, let's make this 1 row and columns 3 columns, because we're going to have maybe 3 GIFs in here. You will see that there's no type of content or data source, because for that, we need to actually set up an API. But the concept is you're going to type in something here, and then information will be displayed here. We're also going to add an image element in here so that our GIFs can be displayed. So let's just put that in here. OK, so the first step in understanding how to read API documentation is you have to create a developer's account. And the reason for that is that many services like to differentiate casual users who are just using an app versus those who are developers building apps for other people. And the next thing you'd want to do is create an app. So just to be completely clear, this is not an app like a Bubble app. This would be just kind of a dashboard where you tell that API, hey, I want to build an actual app using some information from your service. So you're just going to call it an app, but it's actually going to be something much more limited, just kind of like a tracking method for that API that you are interested in using their service. And some of the credentials that identify, that you're using their service is an API key or a client ID and secret. And then, so once you've built an app, and generated an API key or a client ID secret, the next thing you'd want to do is dig into the documentation and look for a few keywords. There's a lot more information on a typical documentation page, but let's keep things simple just so that you can play around with it first. So you look for something called a REST API section. A REST API is an architectural style, or more simply, a set of rules to communicate with web apps. And then once you've identified that section, you should look for something called OAuth 2.0, or with GetPost example. So OAuth 2.0 is kind of a authentication method. There are many different kinds of authentication method, and I'm going to touch upon this a little later in today's tutorial. And basically, you are going to extract some information from the documentation and put that into your Bubble app, so that you can talk to that external service and then pull data from that external service or push data into that external service. OK, with that, let's jump into our first example, which is for Giphy. And the simplest way to find out a developer's portal is to just search whatever that service is with developers. In this case, I already found it out for you. So I'm just going to click this link right here. And I already have an account. It's like creating any other account. And the standard fields apply. I've created an account, and now I'm going to actually create an app. And actually, before that, I'm going to show you one quick thing. So in my dashboard, you'll see your app. That means I created a test app already, which has an API key, which I'm going to delete after this tutorial. But we're going to create a new app from scratch. And so let's call this API hello. And for a description, choose whatever you want. And I'll say to learn about APIs and say create new app. And so API hello was just generated right here with its own key. And that is really critical information for you to start pulling information from Giphy into your Bubble app. So back in our Bubble app, let's look at our plugins tab and add in our API connector plugin. There you go. And install it and say done. OK, so it appears right here, and you can say add another API. So you'll see a few different inputs. I'm going to walk you through all of it. The first thing I want to do, let's just name this Giphy, because we're going to get stuff from Giphy. And give you a high-level view of what these different things mean. API name is where you kind of track the different services you're talking to. Authentication is how that service knows that, hey, you're trying to get information from it and you have the permission to do so. Then you can define headers, which kind of gets a little more specific into like different kinds of formats. Like if you're using like JSON versus like XML, you can add some information right here. And then parameters is kind of trying to tell the service what you're interested in, whether you're like talking to the service to get information or post information. And if you have multiple calls for a service, you can add a shared parameter right here. And then below, you can specify each individual call. And these calls can do different things. Like I can have one call for get, which means I want to extract information from Jiffy. Then I can have another call for post. That means I'm sending information to Jiffy. So our first example will be get. I'm going to call this search because we want to search Jiffy to get GIFs into our app. And we need information here, and we need information for parameters to tell Jiffy what we're interested in. So for that, let's just head into the documentation. So back in our Jiffy developers portal, you can see docs. And docs here, you can see there's like a lot of information here, but like I mentioned, there are a few key fields that you're looking for. And the first thing we want to do is like, how do you authenticate? So I'm just going to type in authentication. That was not easy up front here, but if I look at getting started and I scroll down here, it says access and API keys. And so it says that you need to obtain an API key. And then once you scroll a bit more into like what are the different things you can do with that API key, you can see a bunch of different endpoints. And what we're interested is in search as usual. And so when you click search, it scrolls to something that looks like this. Don't get scared by what looks like a lot of technical jargon because it's actually very simple what this is doing. So what it's telling us is that the main endpoint, kind of the basic like URL we're using to tell Jiffy like, hey, we're interested in GIFs from you, is this. So we're going to paste this into our app right here. And then we need to do a few more things to it. So it says like, hey, Jiffy, I'm talking to you. And then we're going to say, what do we want from Jiffy? And we want to get GIFs from Jiffy, and we want to search for a specific term. So let's copy this path part and just tag that on right here. Now, once you've done that, we're getting close. We need to add a few more things, and that'll be parameters, because what Jiffy tells us is you need to define a few things for us to be able to extract some information. So the first thing is the API key. And for that is a form of authentication. We're going to choose private key in URL. And this private key will be called API key. And the key value we're going to actually get from the app that we generated. So let me just pull it up and copy API hello. And I'm going to paste that in here. So let's just make sure there are no weird spaces. All right. And then for our parameters now, then we just add about 5. And then I'm going to walk you through what all these settings mean. So starting with the basics, we want to search for a specific term. And Jiffy says you could do that by putting this thing called Q. That is your parameter key, and then the value will be what you want to search for. So to start with, I'm just going to say party, for example. And then for limit, that means how many results do I want Jiffy to send back? So we don't want them to send back like 100 or 1,000 GIFs. We just want them to send back a few so that we can test this works. So let me say 3. And then offset, this means that like Jiffy has a library of GIFs, and you can offset if you're familiar with like the first 10 and you want to start with like a few more. We don't really care about that, so we're just going to say 0 offset. And then rating, that means we want to make this content friendly for all age groups. So we're going to make that general rating. And then language, we can stick with English, but you can localize it based on your app users. Okay. So we have set up our parameters, and which tells Giphy what we're interested in extracting from Giphy, you can see these boxes called private and optional. So private is usually a setting when you have some private credentials that you don't want exposed at all. In this case, like nothing is really private because these are just like basic settings. I'm just gonna like uncheck the first one. You can uncheck all of them. It's totally up to you because like there's nothing sensitive here. The sensitive part is the API key, which is not exposed. Okay, so it looks like we have set up our call, but we want to do an initial test of whether we set it up correctly. So click initialize call. This just means that, hey, test whether my setup works. And you'll see a pop-up right here, which says return values. The text is a little faint, but if you like look a little closer, you can see these are all different kinds of links of GIFs returned, and you get a bunch of different options that vary by size based on the kind of like GIFs in the format and sizing that you're interested in. So it looks like we've actually done a pretty decent job of this, and say save. And now we just want to pull this information into our repeating group and image, and you get a little reminder right here. So let's head back to our design tab, and let's do a few things. So the first thing is the repeating group, which is kind of collection point for the data returned from our GIF API. So we're going to say data source, get data from an external API, and choose Giphy search. And you can see party, that's the value that we use to initialize. And instead of party, we want any app user to be able to specify whatever they want to look for. So we're going to say insert dynamic data and get that from input A's value. Okay, so now there's still like a type of content mismatch. And we can get that from search data. And we have one more issue, which is our image, because we haven't specified the source for these dynamic images, which will update every time you enter something new in the input. So it's the current cell search data, and we're going to look for something called fixed with, where is that? Fixed with URL. You can play around with them. There are a whole bunch of different options, but we can test with this. Okay, so let's preview. And then I'm going to say cats. And hey, we've got pictures of cats. And that's how you pull in your GIFs based on a get call from Giphy. And so this is like a really fun example where to recap, we're getting information from Giphy. We're specifying a few parameters based on different options that are available at the search endpoint. And then once we just add those elements to our page and we specify the data source, which is the API calls results, we're able to dynamically search and display information for whatever the user searched in here. So this is a fun example to kind of familiarize yourself with doing get calls, but like not every service is this forgiving. There's some services, especially social media accounts like Facebook and LinkedIn, that require much more information from you before you can start getting information from them. And the first example that we will use is LinkedIn to do this. And to discuss LinkedIn in more detail, we actually need to talk about authentication methods. And it looks like a lot of information here, but I'm going to walk you through each of these points fairly quickly. Just as a quick check, are you guys following so far? Any questions about the get call with Giphy? Feel free to type into your chat. Okay, there's one question about when you specify your API parameters, do you need to insert them all, or can you insert only one? Example for Giphy, the string. So depending on the endpoint, you have to specify some are mandatory parameters. So you definitely want to include a search term because that's what you do with a search endpoint. But you are able to do multiple searches, combined searches based on what that service offers. So this is a fairly simple example. So the parameters that we specified are mandatory parameters. We'll see another example where we're going to like retrieve a whole bunch of different fields. That's right up in our next example for LinkedIn. So heading over, it's a great segue into the LinkedIn example. Speaking more about authentication methods, I actually want to quickly show you something that I will reference in a bit. Which is authentication methods. So there are a whole lot of authentication methods available. The one that we used was with like an API key with like the private key in the URL. But and the next one we're going to discuss is something called user agent flow, which is the OAuth 2 type. And the reason why we're going to use this in this example is because all the major services like Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, everyone uses this. So once you've kind of mastered the concepts behind this, you can like pretty much use every top service in the world. So let's discuss OAuth 2 in a little more detail. So at a high level, OAuth 2 is a protocol to use an API on behalf of a user to access their data. And within this service, like this authentication method, you have to get the client ID and secret from that service so that you can put it in your app connector, API connector, and extract information into your app. And as part of that, you're also going to specify something called scope. Scope is really important because it drives the level of permission to access user data. There's a lot of conversation about this, especially for like social media accounts, so that your end users know exactly what they're sharing with your app. So this is something that you should like do your own research when you're setting up your app API call. And then there are 3 other endpoints that you can that you should look into in the documentation for a service because you need it for your API call. The first one is a login dialog redirect. This is like a login menu for the API. This is where like someone who is trying to log in with Facebook can enter the username and password. Then you have an access token endpoint, which is kind of more backend, but what it allows your app to do is get a temporary access token server side from the API. So that API, like LinkedIn or Facebook, says, hey, you have permission to access data from us. And then finally, the user profile endpoint it allows your app to specify what you're interested in getting for that particular user. So to simplify this quite a bit, you can say that think of this like going to a movie theater where the login dialog is your ticket counter, the access token is your ticket, and the user profile is your actual seat to watch the movie. So we're going to see this in practice, and I'm going to walk you through the steps. So for LinkedIn, the first part will be setting up a developer's account as usual and setting up what we call an app, which is actually just a dashboard with some credentials and not an app. But let's head into the LinkedIn developers portal. And this is a logged in view because I've already set it up. I believe LinkedIn does not allow you to see the documentation unless you sign up for a developer's account. So please do so. And then you will see, as usual, my apps where I already created a test app, but I'm going to create a new one from scratch. And so let's click Create Application. And what we're going to do as our first example is, we're going to pull in information for a particular user who logs in with their LinkedIn account. So you've seen your LinkedIn profiles. It has a person's picture. It has their name. It has their location, information about like their job experience. We're going to extract some of that and display it within our app as a first test. And before we do that, we actually have to fill in a lot of different fields because LinkedIn wants you to be specific about why you need this information and what you need it, like what you're going to do with it. So company name, I've just written self-employment because that's what I signed up with. You can call it whatever. Application name, just kind of call it API hello, like the other one, to learn about APIs. For application description. And then for application logo, I'm going to get it from an assets folder that I have. Note that this was specifically in 80 by 80 pixels because LinkedIn seems to give errors if your photo's in a different format or dimension. Application use, I'm going to choose education. You can choose whatever you want. website URL. This you're going to get it from the app that we just created, which is I'm going to bookmark it so I don't lose it. Okay, and so let's actually create a new page and call it profile. And then we want to set up calls for LinkedIn. So just like we did for Giphy, we're going to say add another API and call this LinkedIn. And for our authentication methods, like I showed you in the manual, there are a bunch of different authentication methods. We're interested in user agent flow. A lot of fields, but I'm going to walk you through it. So what we want as our value for the website URL is when you preview, we want just the base part of this app. So I'm going to paste that in here. Email, name it whatever. I'm going to use my test account. And then after reading, you can enable this and say submit. Okay, so now this takes you to what LinkedIn calls an app. This is not your bubble app. This is just a dashboard with some key information that we'll need. And then you have your client ID and secret, which we will use in our API connector right here. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to refer to the documentation. I'm going to have 3 different tabs open. One will be the LinkedIn documentation. For the initial part, one will be this app dashboard. And then the third thing will be our API connector plugin tab view where we're entering stuff. So bear with me. If you have any questions, I will be sure to get to it. So we want their documentation also open. Okay. So the first thing you'll note here is that you'll see a few different options here and here. For LinkedIn, make sure after you make every changes, you click update, because otherwise LinkedIn doesn't auto-save anything. And so the stuff that you see here with like our basic profile, email, address, company admin, WShare, this is scope. This tells LinkedIn the level of information you're extracting about that user into your app. And so we're going to enable all of these to begin with, but you can narrow it down just based on what your app is doing. So let's just click update. And there, LinkedIn confirmed. And then for the authorized redirect URL, this is something that you will get from your API connector right here, generic redirect URL. Just enable that and copy this and put it in here. And then choose add and update. And the reason for this is that the workflow is that a user signs into their LinkedIn account and should get redirected back to your app. So on the redirect back to your app, you don't want to be overly specific because you want your users to be safely navigated back to your app. And so that's what this link does. It smartly handles the redirect for you. And so that once you've specified that, we're just going to copy the client ID and secret from our app dashboard in LinkedIn into your actual bubble app. So you can dump that in here. And once again, this is confidential. Don't share it with anyone. Put it in here. Okay. And then you can see authentication goes in the header. Enable that. And then we have the 3 different endpoints that we spoke about before. And so I have set it up for you in this reference roadmap, but I'll show you where to find this in LinkedIn's documentation so that it's kind of like you get into the habit of finding information from different APIs. Every API will structure this differently, but just look for the keywords and you should be able to find pretty much anything you need. So looking at their main documentation page, there are a few different sections, but like this is kind of helpful because we first want to start with authentication because that's our first step. The user needs to be able to log in to your app using LinkedIn and to be able to log into LinkedIn that can then send information from LinkedIn to your app. So let's click this and then scroll a little further down and you can see this link. This is where you can get your login menu for that user. And so you just paste that in here. And next, we need to look at where to get the token from, access token that allows your app to talk to LinkedIn. And LinkedIn gives you the permission to then ask for information about that user. So for that, let's scroll a little further down in LinkedIn's documentation. And you can find that right here with your access token. That's the word we're looking for. Put that in here. Now for the user profile endpoint, you might have to dig a little further because every service will define the user profile endpoint uniquely. And this is kind of the starting point where you can start extracting information about a user. So for that, let's move back one level up in their documentation. And we will say getting started with the REST API. If you scroll a little further down, you can see that the user profile endpoint is this. This is the starting point. So you can see an example where it says like Frodo Baggins. So that's a typical user. And then there's like data points about this user that you can get access to once that user logs in with their LinkedIn credentials. So we're going to just copy this endpoint and paste it in here. And one thing to note that if you just like used it as is, this call as is, you might run into a few errors. So we might actually have to specify our format. Which just like tells LinkedIn we're going to send information and get information in a JSON format. Like this is something that is not necessarily required by other services, but while playing around with this API, I saw that I would get errors unless I did this. So there's like a lot of trial and error involved, but like you will start getting an intuition about how to debug these things on your own. And then for the user ID key path, you can leave that as ID and email, because that's how users are signing in to LinkedIn. So far, so good. We need to actually test whether a user can log in with their LinkedIn credentials. And you can go to your workflows tab. And actually, before that, let's start with a button that starts our workflow. And let's call that LinkedIn login. Right. And start edit workflow for someone clicking that button, your end user, and that would sign up, login with a social network. And we can see LinkedIn appear right here. That's what we want. We want a user to be able to sign up using their LinkedIn credentials. And then you click preview. And let's say LinkedIn login. So this takes me to the login menu in LinkedIn. I'm going to enter test credentials and sign in. Any user will enter their information. And then you see this intermediate page that is asking you for permissions. This lines up exactly with the scope that you defined, and basically allows your app to access your email address and a few details from your basic profile. So I'm going to say allow. And then you get a message that says you have successfully initialized the Auth2 connection for API. And so you can go back to the editor and keep building. That's great. That's what we want. And we're going to proceed by building a form that reflects the information that we can retrieve from LinkedIn once we have successfully signed in. So let us go to a, let's start with the container, and we can draw it here. And we'll fill in more fields into this container after we've actually set up our call. So right here under LinkedIn's API, we're going to add in the plugin API call, we're going to call this profile, because we're actually going to do two calls. I definitely want to show you how to post as well and not just get if you have time. And so for get, we have to specify the endpoint for that user. So going back into our LinkedIn documentation, let us move up one level as usual and look at sign in with LinkedIn. And so this shows you how to extract different data points about a particular user. So this is how your search term is actually a lot more. So you're getting that person's ID, you're getting the number of connections, you're getting their picture URL. Whereas like in Giphy, we're only looking for like one term, but here we're actually getting a whole bunch of different things from LinkedIn. So in my deck, I've actually set up this for a number of fields that we're interested in. So I'm just going to copy that over, and we'll walk through what each of those fields mean in a bit. So let's paste that in here. So the only difference between this user profile endpoint and what you see right here are the fields in here. Because we're saying like, hey, once we know the user is logged in and the user has given us permission, please share this information from LinkedIn with our app. So everything else is pretty much identical to what we had. And so let's initialize this call to see if this works. Okay, so as usual, we get a pop-up with some test values right here about my test account, including the name and the email address and the location. Just all the fields that are requested are shown right here. You can also see like a more raw version of what is returned from the API, and that's right here. But like Bubble does a few smart things to like streamline the information returned so you can very intuitively access it on your design tab. So click Save. So it means that we've set up this call correctly. Go to your design tab in this group, and now we can start referring to that data source. So you can say get data from an external API and choose LinkedIn profile this time. And here you can change it immediately to show the profile type of content. And then we can start drawing a text element in here with some details about the person who just logged in. So parent groups profiles first name, add a space, parent groups profiles last name. And then I'm just going to copy this over, do another one. And this time I want their location, perhaps. You can do whatever you want, like choose whatever fields that you're interested in extracting. I'm just going to show a few for demonstration purposes. And then their summary. And then we also want their picture. So I'm going to take an image element and draw it in here. And then for the dynamic image source, once again, parent groups profile and then picture URL. Great. Now we also want a direct link to their LinkedIn profile. So I'm going to draw a link element on this page. And let's just call that profile. And this is going to be an external URL because the workflow is that a user clicks on this and gets directed to their LinkedIn profile in LinkedIn. So their destination URL would be the public profile URL, and we wanted to open in a new tab. Okay, let's preview. Okay, so you can see that I logged in as Jessica Smith with my test email, and it shared information about my location, my summary. It gives a profile link and this thumbnail picture. Let me click on the profile. And here you have it. So this is a test profile link with experience. So what you have done so far is extract this information from LinkedIn's API by one, setting up a developer's account, and then telling LinkedIn what fields you're interested in after authenticating as a specific user. So this was a slightly more complex example than Giphy, but you can start saying that pretty much the same mental map that you used to authenticate with user agent flow for LinkedIn can be applied to pretty much any social in the world. So you can like integrate Facebook, Twitter, you name it, into your app using a very similar method. Any questions so far about this example? We'll definitely cover it more in detail at the end of the session, but I just want to make sure none of you are getting lost. If you have any questions, just put it in the chat. Can you do this with Google Drive, folders, send files? Yes, you can definitely do that. Google obviously has a suite of services, so it'll be the same method, but like the endpoints will be different per each service. and your scopes will be defined differently. So use the same method, but like it starts getting much more like specific based on which service you're using for Google. Okay. Question, do you send a replay after? Yes, we do send a video recording. So, we definitely want to make sure that you guys can understand me in real time, but we will share a video with you. If you have follow-up questions, we're always available. Okay, so now we're going to head into a post example, which is different, but again, we can figure it out. Let's close this, and then we can actually close this too. All right, so we're going to build a new page in our Bubble app, and let's call this post. Okay, and for this one, it makes more sense to actually set up the call for our post, because this will have many more fields that we're interested in, and it's much more dynamic, starting with the plugin tab than the design tab. So for another call right here, we're going to call it posts. And this time we're going to make this a action, not data. So data is when you want to just use something as a data source, returned from the API. And action is when you're initiating a workflow that does something with that API. This will become much more clear when we actually see the example. And then as a method, we'll choose post. Okay. And then you'll see like a new input appears right here, which is JSON body. This is a way to send things with your call that we want to post onto that API. So in this case, like you've seen in LinkedIn, that you have different people share their stories or like messages or articles. That's pretty much what we're going to do, but we're going to do it from your app. And back in here, we are going to, as usual, use the same app that we created in LinkedIn and set up another call. So let us look at the documentation for post. And what we're interested in the documentation is share on LinkedIn. So scroll a bit, and you can see that the basic endpoint is this. And we're going to just copy that over for a call. Then you need to do a few more things. So if you read this a little closely, we have to specify a few more headers for this. And so you're just going to copy this content type and just add a header here, add a header here. It just kind of tells LinkedIn that, hey, I'm going to send information in this format. So this is how you deal with it. Okay. And then we're going to do something interesting here. So for body, we want to like send a whole bunch of different fields that we dynamically enter. So like your end user is going to like share an article, share the title, give a cute message, and then post it, and they should see it appear into their LinkedIn account like a story. So for that, we want to mimic this kind of a structure. We're going to send a JSON body that like references this information. So it'll have content, and then nested within content will have these few different items that we're sending dynamically to LinkedIn's API. And so the way LinkedIn sends this as a JSON body is, scroll down here, like this. So we want to match something that looks just like this. So let me show you one method. So if I just copy this straight up and I put it in here, what this call would do when I initialize it is post just the values that are entered here. But we want it dynamic. We want to be able to specify what URL, what is the title, just for our users to be able to do it dynamically. So I'm going to copy something from here, which has just one small difference, which I'll point out to you, is that it has these different dynamic values surrounded by this symbol. And that allows you to specify what you want to post dynamically. So let's uncheck private because it's not really private. And then we can try and initialize this. And before we actually do that, let's also do capture response headers. And the reason for that is because not only do you want LinkedIn to like accept what you're posting, but you also want LinkedIn to like send back some information that, hey, your post went through successfully. Here's all the information about what you just posted. So we're going to capture the response headers for this. And then let's just test some values. So for comments, I'm going to say cool article. Build amazing apps. And then the submitted URL and submitted image URL. So let us find a good example of that. So I have a URL I want to test. I'm going to paste that into this. And then submitted image URL, I'm going to choose something else. Might be some trial and error involved, but that's what setting up API calls is all about. So once I have entered these values, let me try and say initialize call. Okay, so it looks like it posted something, and in the response, we have a link potentially that will contain what we want to see. Let's look at the body update URL. I believe that's the one where it should have posted as me. Cool article. Build amazing apps with the link that I just shared. And if I click on it, pulls up a TechCrunch article. So yeah, that's how we have initialized a call to programmatically send information from our app and control our LinkedIn profile to display the post. But we want to make this easy for your app users. So we're going to do this in our design tab to make this much more user-friendly. So let's start by building a group right here. And then we can add also a button. And let's call this post. And when post is clicked, we wanted to do an action. And that action is, let's see. Wait for a second. Just 1 minute. This kind of takes a little bit of time to reflect immediately, but we will try our best. I'm going to do one more thing. So let's try initializing. Do not post duplicate content. Okay, let me refresh this. So what we want to happen is LinkedIn needs to know that we're trying to do an action, and it should show up under plugin actions. And at the moment, LinkedIn is being a little finicky in doing that. But the idea is that when you click post, it's actually going to do what you just specified and post that immediately onto LinkedIn. So it's going to be pretty much the same thing. We just need LinkedIn to refresh this information. So meanwhile, do you guys have any questions that I can answer in the meantime? You can enter that in your chat. Okay, question about, is it the same process to build plugins? Yes, you can do something very nifty, which is like copy whatever call that you have in here. Like for example, you can duplicate, or you can do copy right here and then create a new plugin. Let's see if I can quickly show you that. And then under API calls, paste from API connector. And pretty much everything that you entered for your LinkedIn call just copied over into your plugin. So that's how you can build plugins, just by copying calls from your API connector over. And then another question about what is the impact when it's private or not. So when it's private, that is, I believe we were talking about the parameters. Those are for like private credentials. So those are things that you don't want to share at all. Whereas like if it's unchecked and not private, it's possible for people to access the information you have used for that call. Okay, further questions on can you build your own plugin webinar at some point? Yep, we can definitely consider that. It's much more advanced because the idea there is that you're building a plugin and then you're sharing that plugin, or other users can install that plugin, and then for their apps, they have their own end users. So there are like a bunch of different permissioning considerations and like keys and stuff that you need to think about when you're building your plugin. Then the next question about how does Bubble handle an array for a parameter? So there are multiple ways to do this. So first you need to see like how does the API receive your parameter values, and based on that, like you can send information either like in a there's a way to like send information in like a nested format, but there are a few considerations based on the API. So based on your particular example, the answer might vary. Question about, do you know if I could post to Telegram the same way? So the method that we've described here can work for like pretty much any RESTful API. So like as long as Telegram exposes that and you've set up your permissions right, you should be able to do that. Okay. We have a question about native mobile apps. So our focus today was on web apps. But like if you're building a native app based on your web app, you can do that with a wrapper. You can definitely like pretty much use the same concepts of like permissions and setting up scope and doing your API calls all the same. There might be a few other nuances based on the wrapper that you use, but this is quite an industry standard. Like once you have perfected the major authentication methods and like how to get posts, you're like 70% there on like using any service. Okay, so before we actually close out the session, I wanted to share a few resources with you on how to proceed when you're doing your own experiments. So the first thing is the manual that I want to talk about. I kind of gave you a quick peek into that, where it's adding API connections, where you can see different kinds of authentication methods other than user agent flow and the private key in URL, which is what we covered. So that's always a good place to start. Then we also have a reference which will discuss logging in with the social network in detail, where you can specify the OAuth provider. In our case, it was LinkedIn, where we logged in with LinkedIn and then could extract data for that user. So this discusses it more in detail. And then one more quick thing is like a debugger. So people are mostly familiar with using debugger when you're doing like searches on your database and like you get a message about like, hey, your fields are not set up correctly. You can get like a similar message for raw error from API. This indicates that you've sent information to an API in a method that gives an error. And so like the API will give you clues on how to fix it. So the debugger is another great place to see the issue. And then separately, the forum, like, all the top social networks as well as like services used around the world are things that other users have integrated within their app, and they should be able to guide you. And then finally, while you're playing around with it and you believe that there's like a limitation on bubble site or just something that you want more help with, like you can always reach out to us, and we can walk you through like what are the different methods to try to integrate with your API and get the right information into your app and export it from your app. With that, I'd like to close out this session. Thank you so much for attending. And if you have questions while working through different APIs, just drop us a note. And we're happy to reach out to you guys one-on-one, as well as even consider like a forum post if there seems to be a demand for specific APIs that all of you are interested in. See you next time.